Welcome, my darlings. Make yourself comfortable, and I have a tale to tell you. If you enjoy it, please be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and leave me a comment. I always enjoy your comments. Now, let us begin. At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. Chapter 2. Popular imagination, I judge, responded actively to our wireless bulletins of Lake's start northwestward into regions never trodden by human foot or penetrated by human imagination. Though we did not mention his wild hopes of revolutionizing the entire science of biology and geology, his preliminary sledging and boring journey of January 11th to 18th with Pixabay and 5 others, marred by the loss of 2 dogs in an upset when crossing one of the great pressure ridges in the ice, had brought up more and more of Archean slate, and even I was interested by the singular profusion of evident fossil markings in that unbelievable ancient stratum. These markings, however, were of very primitive life forms, involving no great paradox except that any life form should occur in rock as definitively Precambrian as this seemed to be. Hence I still failed to see the good sense of Lake's demand for an interlude in our time-saving program. An interlude requiring the use of 4 planes, many men, and the whole of the expedition's mechanical apparatus. I did not, in the end, veto the plan, though I decided not to accompany the Northwest party, despite Lake's plea for my geological advice. While they were gone, I would remain at the base with Pixabay and 5 men and work our final plans for the eastward shift. In preparation for this transfer, one of the planes had begun to move up a good gasoline supply from McMurdo Sound. But this could temporarily wait. I kept with me 1 sledge and 9 dogs, since it is unwise to be at any time without possible transportation in an utterly tenantless world of aeon-long death. Lake's sub-expedition into the unknown, as everyone will recall, sent out its own reports from the shortwave transmitters on the plains, these being simultaneously picked up by our apparatus at the southern base and by the Arkham at McMurdo Sound, whence they were relayed to the outside world on wavelengths up to 50 meters. The start was made January 22nd at 4 a.m., and the first wireless message we received came only 2 hours later, when Lake spoke of descending and starting a small-scale ice melting and bore at a point some 300 miles away from us. 6 hours after that, a second and very excited message told of the frantic, beaver-like work whereabout a shallow shaft had been sunk and blasted, culminating in the discovery of slate fragments with several markings approximately like the one which had caused the original puzzlement. 3 hours later, a brief bulletin announced the resumption of the flight in the teeth of a raw and piercing gale, and when I dispatched a message of protest against further hazards, Lake replied curtly that his new specimen made any hazard worth taking. I saw that his excitement had reached the point of mutiny, and that I could do nothing to check his headlong risk of the whole expedition's success. But it was appalling to think of his plunging deeper and deeper into that treacherous and sinister white immensity of tempest and unfathomable mysteries which stretched off for some 1,500 miles to the half-known, half-suspected coastline of Queen Mary and Knoxland. Then, in about an hour and a half more, came that doubly excited message from Lake's moving plane, which almost reversed my sentiment and made me wish I had accompanied the party. At 10:05 p.m. on wing, after snowstorm, have spied mountain range ahead, higher than any hitherto seen, may equal Himalayas, allowing for height of plateau. Probable latitude 76 degrees 15, longitude 113 degrees 10 east. Reaches as far to the right and left. Suspicion of 2 smoking cones. At all peaks black and bare of snow. Gale blowing off them impedes navigation. After that, Pabadi, the men, and I hung breathlessly over the receiver. Thought of this titanic mountain rampart, 700 miles away, inflamed our deepest sense of adventure, and we rejoiced that our expedition, if not ourselves personally, had been its discovery. Half an hour, Lake called us again. Moulton's plane forced down on plateau and foothills, but nobody hurt and perhaps can repair. Shall transfer essentials to other 3 for return or further moves if necessary. But no more heavy plane travel needed just now. Mountains surpass anything in imagination. I'm going up scouting in Carol's plane with all weight out. You can't imagine anything like this. Highest peaks must go over 30,000 feet. Everest out of the running. Atward to work out height with theodolite, while Carol and I go up. Probably wrong about the cones, for formation looks stratified, possibly Precambrian slate with other strata mixed in. Queer skyline effects, rather sections of cubes clinging to the highest peaks. Whole thing marvelous in red gold light of low sun, like land of mystery in a dream or gateway of forbidden world of untrodden wonder. Wish you were here to study, though it was technically sleeping time. Not one of us listeners thought for a moment of retiring. It must have been a good deal, the same at McMurdo Sound, where the supply cache and the Arkham were also getting the messages. For Captain Douglas gave out a call congratulating everybody on the important find, and Sherman, the cache operator, seconded his sentiment. We were sorry, of course, about the damaged airplane, but hoped it could be easily mended. Then at 11 p.m. came another call from Lake. Up with Carol over highest foothills. Don't dare try any real tall peaks in present weather, but shall later. Frightful work climbing and hard going at this altitude, but worth it. Great range, fairly solid. Hence can't get any glimpses beyond. Main summit exceeds Himalayas and very queer. Range looks like Precambrian slate, with plain signs of many other upheavaled stratas. Was wrong about the volcanism. Goes further in either direction than we can see. Swept clear of snow above about 21,000 feet. Odd formation on slopes of highest mountains. Great low square blocks with exact vertical sides and rectangular lines of low vertical ramparts. Like an old Asian castle clinging to the steep mountains in Rohrit's paintings. Impressive from distance. Flew close to some, and Carol thought they were formed of some smaller separate pieces, but that is probably weathering. Most edges crumbled and rounded off as it exposed to storms and climates change for millions of years. Parts, especially those upper parts, seem to be of lighter colored rock than any visible strata on the slopes proper. Hence any evidence crystalline origin. Close flying shows many cave mouths, some unusually regular in outline, square or semicircular. You must come and investigate. I think I saw some ramparts squarely on top of one peak. Height seems about 30,000 to 35,000 feet. I'm up 21,500 myself, in devilishly gnawing cold. Wind whistles and pipes through passes and in and out of caves, but no flying danger so far. From then on, for another half hour, Lake kept up a running fire of comment and expressed his intention of climbing some of the peaks on foot. I replied that I would join him as soon as I could. Send a plane. and that Peabody and I would work out the best gasoline plan, just where and how to concentrate our supply in view of the expedition's altered character. Obviously, Lake's boring operations, as well as his airplane activity, would need a great deal delivered at the new base, which he was to establish at the foot of the mountains, and it was possible that the eastward flight might not be made after all this season. In connection with this business, I called Captain Douglas and asked him to get as much as possible out of the ships and up the barriers with the single dog team we had left. A direct route across the unknown region between Lake and McMurdo Sound was what we really ought to establish. Lake called me later to say that he had decided to let the camp stay where Moulton's plane had been forced down, and where repairs had already progressed somewhat. The ice sheets were very thin, with dark ground here and there visible. He would sink some borings and blast at the very point before making any sledge trips or climbing expeditions. He spoke of the ineffable majesty of the whole scene, and the queer state of his sensing at being in the lee of vast, silent pinnacles, whose rank shot up like a wall reaching the sky at the world's rim. Atwood's theodolite observations had placed the height of the 5 tallest peaks at from 30,000 to 34,000 feet. The wind-swept nature of the terrain clearly disturbed Lake, for it argued the occasional existence of prodigious gales, violent beyond anything we had so far encountered. His camp lay a little more than 5 miles from where the higher foothills rose abruptly. I could almost trace a note of subconscious alarm in his words, flashed across a glacial void of 700 miles, as he urged that we all hasten with the matter and get the strange new region disposed of as soon as possible. He was about to rest now, after a continuous day of work, almost unparalleled speed, strenuous, and results. In the morning, I had a 3-cornered wireless talk with Lake and Captain Douglas at their wildly separated bases. It was agreed that one of Lake's planes would come to my base for Peabody, 5 men and myself, as well as for all the fuel it could carry. The rest of the fuel question, depending on our decision about an easterly trip, could wait for a few days, since Lake had enough for immediate camp heat and borings. Eventually, the old southern base ought to be restocked, but if we postponed the easterly trip, we would not use it until the next summer. And meanwhile, Lake must send a plane to explore a direct route between his new mountains and McMurdo Sound. Peabody and I prepared to close our base for a short or long period, as the case might be. If we wintered in the Arctic, we would probably fly straight from Lake's base to the Arkham without returning to this spot. Some of our conical tents had already been reinforced by blocks of hard snow, and now we decided to complete the job of making a permanent village, owing to a very liberal tent supply. Lake had with him all that his base would need, even after our arrival. I wired that Peabody and I would be ready for the northwest move after 1 day's work and 1 night's rest. Our labors, however, were not very steady after 4 p.m. For about that time, Lake began sending in the most extraordinary and exciting messages about his workday had started unproposedly since an aeroplane survey of the nearly exposed rock surface showed an entire absence of those Archean and primordial strata for which he was looking, and which formed so great a part of the colossal peaks that loomed up at tantalizing distance from camp. Most of the rocks glimpsed were apparently Jurassic and Comanchian sandstone, and Permian and Triassic schists, with now and then glossy black outcrops suggesting a hard and slaty coal. This rather discouraged Lake, whose plans all hinged on unearthing specimens more than 500 million years older. It was clear to him that in order to recover the Archean slate vein in which he had found the odd markings, he would have to make a long sledge trip from these foothills to the steep slopes of the gigantic mountains themselves. He had resolved, nevertheless, to do some local boring as part of the expedition's general program. Hence he set up the drill and put 5 men to work with them, while the rest finished setting the camp and repairing the damaged aeroplane. The softest visible rock, a sandstone about a quarter of a mile from camp, had been chosen for the first sampling, and the drill made excellent progress without much supplementary blasting. It was about 3 hours afterwards, following the first really heavy blast of the operation, that the shouting of the drill crew was heard, and that young Gedney, the acting foreman, rushed into camp with the startling news. They had struck a cave. Early in the boring, the sandstone had given place to a vein of Comanchean limestone, full of minute fossil cephalopods, corals, echini, and porphyria, with occasional suggestions of cilious sponges and marine vertebrate bones, the latter probably of teleoites, sharks, and ganoids. This in itself was important enough, as affording the first vertebrate fossils the expedition had yet secured. But when shortly afterwards the drill head dropped through the stratum into apparently vacancy, a whole new and doubly intense wave of excitement spread among the excavators. A good-sized blast had laid open the subterranean secret, and now, through a jagged aperture, perhaps 5 feet across and 3 feet thick, these yawned before the avid searchers a section of shallow limestone hollowly worn more than 50 million years ago by the trickling groundwater of a bygone tropical world. The hollowed layer was not more than 7 or 8 feet deep, but extended off indefinitely in all directions, and had a fresh, slightly moving air which suggested its membership in an extensive subterranean system. Its roof and floor were abundantly equipped with large stalactites and stalagmites, some of which met in columnar form. But, important above all else, was the vast deposit of shell and bone, which in places nearly choked the passage, washed down from unknown jungles of Mesozoic tree ferns and fungi, the forest of tertiary cycades, fan palms, and primitive angiosperms. This osseous medley contained representatives of more Cretaceous, Eocene, and other animal species than the greatest paleontologist could have counted or classified in a year. Mollusks, crustaceans, armor, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and early mammals, great and small, known and unknown. No wonder Geddy ran back to the camp shouting, and no wonder everyone else dropped work and rushed headlong through the biting cold to where the tall derrick marked a new-found gateway to secrets of inner earth and vanished eons. When Lake had satisfied the first keen edge of his curiosity, he scribbled a message in his notebook and had young Moulton run back to the camp to dispatch it by wireless. This was my first word of its discovery, and it told of the identification of early shells, bones of ganoids and placoderms, remnants of Lamborithodonta and Thylacinidae, a great mosasaur skull fragments, dinosaur vertebrae and armor plates, pterodactyl teeth and wing bones, Archaeopteryx debris, Miocene shark's teeth, primitive bird skulls, and other bones of archaic mammals such as Pleiotherian, Phodon, Eohippie, Oronodons, and Titanotheridid. There was nothing as recent as a mastodon elephant, true camel, deer, or bovine animal. Hence, Lake concluded that the last deposits had occurred during the Oligocene age, and that the hollowed stratum had laid in its present dried, dead, and inaccessible state for at least 30 million years. On the other hand, the prevalence of very early life forms was singular in the highest degree. Through the limestone formation was on the evidence of such typical embedded fossils as ventriculites, positively and unmistakably Comanchian and not a particle earlier. The free fragments in the hollow space included a surprising proportion from organisms hitherto considered as peculiar to far older periods, even rudimentary fish, mollusks, and corals, as remote as the Silurian or Ordovician. The inevitable inference was that part of the world there had been a remarkable and unique degree of continuity between life of over 300 million years ago and that of only 30 million years ago. How far this continuity had been extended beyond the Oligocene age, when the caverns was closed, was of course past all speculation. In any event, the coming of the frightful ice in the Pleistocene some 500,000 years ago, a mere yesterday compared with the age of this cavity, must have put an end to any of the primal forms which had locally managed to outlive their common terms. Lake was not content to let his first message stand, but had another bulletin written and dispatched across the snow to the camp before Moulton could get back. After that, Moulton stayed at the wireless in one of the planes, transmitting to me and to the Arkham for relaying to the outside world the frequent postscripts which Lake sent him by any succession of messengers. Those who followed the newspapers will remember the excitement created among men of science by that afternoon's report. Reports which have finally led, after all of these years, to the organization of that very Starkweather Moor expedition which I am so anxious to dissuade from its purposes. I had better give the message literally as Lake sent them, and as our base operator, McTighe, translated them from his pencil shorthand. Fowler makes discovery of highest importance in sandstone and limestone fragments from blasts. Several distinct triangular striated prints like those in Archean slate prove that source survived from over 600 million years ago to Comanchian times without more than a moderate morphological change and decrease in average size. Comanchian prints apparently more primitive or decadent, if anything, the older ones. Emphasis important of discovery. In press will mean to biology what Einstein has meant to mathematics and physics. Join up with my previous work and amplifying conclusions. Appears to indicate, as I suspected, the Earth was seen whole cycle or cycles of organic life before known one that began with Archaeozoic cells, was evolved and specialized not later than 1,000 million years ago, when planet was young and recently uninhabited. For any life form of normal protoplasmic structure, question arises when, where, and how development took place. Later, examining certain skeletal frames of the large land and marine saurians and primitive mammals, finding singular local wounds or injuries to bony structures not attributable to any known predatory or carnivorous animal of any period, of two sorts, straight, penetrated bones, and apparently hacking incisors. One or two cases of clearly severed bones. Not many specimens affected. Am sending to camp for electric torches. We'll extend search area underground by hacking away stalactites. Still later, have found peculiar soapstone fragments about 6 inches across and 1.5 inches thick, wholly unlike any visible local formation. Greenish, but no evidence to place its period. Has curious smoothness and regularity. Shaped like 5-pointed star with tips broke off, and signs of other cleavage at inward angles, and in center of surface. Small, smooth depression in the center of unbroken surface arouses much curiosity as to the source and weathering. Probably some freak of water action. Carroll, with magnifier, thinks he can make out additional markings of geologic significance. Groups of tiny dots in regular patterns. Dog's growing uneasy as we work and seems to hate this soapstone. Must see if it has any peculiar odor. We'll report again when Mills gets back with light, and we'll start on underground area. 10:15 p.m. Important discovery. Orendorf and Watkins, working underground at 9:45 with light, found monstrous barrel-shaped fossil of wholly unknown nature. Probably vegetable unless overgrown specimen of unknown marine radiate. Tissue evidently preserved by mineral salts, tough as leather, but astonishingly flexible, retained in places. Marks of broken off parts at ends and around sides. 6 feet end to end, 3 5/10 feet central diameter, tapering to 1 foot at each end. Like a barrel with 5 bulging ridges in place of stabs. Literal breakage as of diminished stalks. Are at equator in the middle of the ridges. In furrows between ridges are curious growths, combs or wings that fold up and spread out like fans. All greatly damaged, but one which gives almost 7-foot wing spread. Arraignment reminds one certain monsters of primal myth. Especially fabled elder things in the Necronomicon. These wings seem to be membranous, stretched on frameworks of glandular tubing, apparently minute orifices in frame tubing at wing tips, end of body shriveled, giving no clue to interior or what had been broken off there. Must dissect when we get back to camp. Can't decide whether vegetables or animals. Many features obviously of almost incredible primitiveness. Have set all hands cutting stalactites and looking for further specimens. Additional scarred bones found, but these must wait. Having trouble with dogs, they can't endure the new specimens and would probably tear it to pieces if we didn't keep it at a distance from them. 11:30 p.m. Attention, Dyer, Pabodie, Douglas. Matter of highest, I might say transcendent, importance. Arkham must relay to Kingsport Head Station at once. Strange barrel growth is an Archean thing that has left prints in rocks, mills. Bourdreau and Fowler discovered clusters of 13 more at underground point 40 feet from aperture, mixed with curious round and configured soapstone fragments smaller than the one previously found. Star-shaped, but no markings of breakage except for at some of the points. Of organic specimens, 8 apparently perfect with all appendages, having brought all to the surface, leading off dogs to distance. They cannot stand the things. Give close attention to the descriptions and repeat back for accuracy. Paper must get it right. Objects are 8 feet long all over. 6 foot, 5-ridged barrel torsos, 3 5/10 feet central diameter, 1 foot end diameters, dark gray, flexible, and infinitely tough. 7-foot membranous wings of same color, found folded spread out of furrows between ridges. Wing framework tubular or glandular or lighter gray, with orifices at wingtips. Spread wings have serrated edge, around equator, one at center apex of each of the 5 verticals. Staff-like ridges are 5 systems of light gray flexible arms or tentacles found tightly folded to torso, but expandable to a maximum length of over 3 feet. Like arms of primitive crinoids, single stalks 3 inches diameter branch after 6 inches into 5 substalks, each of which branches after 8 inches into 5 small tapering tentacles or tendricles, giving each stalk a total of 25 tentacles. At top of torso, blunt, bulbous neck of lighter gray with gill-like suggestions hold yellowish 5-point, starfish-shaped apparent head covering with 3-inch wire cilia of various prismatic colors. Head thick and puffy, about 2 feet point to point, with 3-inch flexible yellowish tubes projecting from each point. Slit in exact center of top, probably breathing aperture. At the end of each tube is spherical expansion where yellow membrane rolls back on handling to reveal glassy, red iris globe, evidently an eye. 5 slightly longer reddish tubes started from the inner angles of the starfish-shaped head, and in the end a sac-like swelling of the same color which, upon pressure, open to bell-shaped orifices 2 inches maximum diameter and lined with sharp, white tooth-like projections, probably mouths. All these tubes, cilia, and points of starfish head found folded tightly down, tubes and points clinging to bulbous neck and torso. Flexibility surprising despite vast toughness. At the bottom of torso, rough but dissimilarly functioning counterparts of head arrangements exist. Bulbous, light gray pseudo-neck without gill suggestions hold greenish 5-point starfish arrangements. Tough, muscular arms 4 feet long and tapering from 7 inches diameter at the base to about 2 5/10 at point. To each point is attached small end of a greenish 5-vein membranous triangle 8 inches long and 6 wide at furthest end. This is the paddle fin or pseudofoot, which had been making prints in rocks from 1,000 million to 50 or 60 million years ago. From inner angles of starfish arrangement projected 2-foot reddish tubes tapering from 3-inch diameters at the base at one tip, orifices at the tip. All of these parts infinitely tough and leathery, but extremely flexible. 4-foot arms with paddles, undoubtedly used for locomotion of some sort, marine or otherwise. When moved, displayed suggestion of exaggerated muscularity. As found, all these projections tightly folded over a pseudo-neck and end of torso, corresponding to projections at the other end. Cannot yet assign positivity to animal or vegetable kingdom, but odds now favor animal. Probably represents incredible advanced evolution of the radia without loss of certain primitive features. Echinoderm resemblance unmistakable despite local contradictory evidence. Wing structures puzzles in view of probable marine habitation, but many have use in water navigation. Symmetry is curiously vegetable-like, suggesting vegetables' essential up and down structure rather than animals' fore and aft structure. Fabulously early date of evolution, preceding even simplest archaean protozoa hitherto known, baffles all conjecture as to its origin. Complete specimens have such uncanny resemblance to certain creatures of primal myth that suggestion of ancient existence outside Antarctica becomes inevitable. Dyer and Peabody have read Necronomicon and seen Clark Ashton Smith's nightmare paintings based on text, and will understand when I speak of elder things supposed to have created all earth life as a jest or mistake. Students have always thought conception formed from morbid imagination's treatment of very ancient tropical radiata, also like prehistoric folklore things Wilmarth had spoken of, Cthulhu cult appendages, etc. Vast field of study open, deposits probable of the late Cretaceous or early Eocene period. Judging from associated specimens, massive stalagmites deposited above them. Hard work hewing out, but toughness prevented damage. State of preservation miraculous, evidently owing to limestone action. No more found so far, but will resume search later. Job now to get 14 huge specimens to camp without dogs which bark furiously and can't be trusted near them. With 9 men, 3 left to guard the dogs, we ought to manage the 3 sledges fairly well, though wind is bad. Must establish plain communication with McMurdo Sound and begin shipping material. But I've got to dissect one of these things before we take any rest. Wish I had a real laboratory here. Dyer better kick himself for having tried to stop my westward trip. First for the world's greatest mountains, and then this. If this last isn't the high spot of the expedition, I don't know what is. We're made scientifically. Congrats, Babodi, on the drill that opened up the cave. Now will Arkham please repeat description? The sensations of Pabodi and myself at receipt of this report was almost beyond description, nor were our companions much behind us in enthusiasm. McTighe, who had hastily translated a few high spots as they came from the droning receiving set, wrote out the entire message from his shorthand version as soon as Lake's operator signed off. All appreciated the epoch-making significance of the discovery, and I sent Lake congratulations as soon as Arkham's operator had repeated back the descriptive parts at requested. And my example was to follow from Sherman, from his station at McMurdo Sound supply cache, as well as by Captain Douglas of the Arkham. Later, as the head of the expedition, I added some remarks to be relayed through the Arkham to the outside world. Of course, rest was an absurd thought amid the excitement, and my only wish was to get to Lake's camp as quickly as I could. It disappointed me when he sent word that a rising mountain gale made early aerial travel impossible. But within an hour and a half, interest again rose to banish disappointment. Lake, sending more messages, told of the completely successful transportation of the fountain, great specimen, to the camp. It had been a hard pull, for the things were surprisingly heavy, but 9 men had accomplished it very neatly. Now some of the party were hurriedly building a snow corral as a safe distance from camp, to which the dogs could be brought for greater convenience in feeding. The specimens were laid out on the hard snow near the camp, save for one which Lake was making crude attempts at dissection. This dissection seemed to be a greater task than had been expected, for despite the heat of the gasoline stove in the newly raised laboratory tent, the deceptively flexible tissues of the chosen specimen, a powerful and intact one, lost nothing of their more than leathery toughness. Lake was puzzled as to how he might make the requisite incisions without violence destructive enough to upset all the structural niceties he was looking for. He had, it is true, 7 more perfect specimens, but these were too few to use up recklessly unless the cave might later yield an unlimited supply. Accordingly, he removed the specimen and dragged in one which, though having remains of starfish arrangements at both ends, was badly crushed and partially disrupted along one of the great torso furrows. Results quickly reported over the wireless were baffling and provocative indeed. Nothing like delicacy or accuracy was possible with instruments hardly able to cut the abnormalous tissue. But the little that was achieved left us all awed and bewildered. Existing biology would have to be wholly revised, for this thing was no product of any cell growth science knows about. There had been scarcely any mineral replacement, and despite an age of perhaps 40 million years, the internal organs were wholly intact. The leathery, undeteriorative, and almost indestructible quality was an inherent attribute of the thing's form of organization, and pertained to some Paleocene cycle of invertebrate evolution utterly beyond our powers of speculation. At first, all that Lake found was dry, but as the heated tent produced its thawing effect, an organic moisture of pungent and offensive odor was encountered towards the thing's uninjured side. It was not blood, but a thick, dark green fluidity, apparently answering the same purpose. By the time Lake reached the stage, all 37 dogs had been brought to the still, uncompleted corral near the camp, and even at that distance set up a savage barking and showing of restlessness at the acrid, diffused scent. Far from helping to place any strange entity, this provisional dissection merely deepened its mystery. All guesses about its external members had been correct, and on the evidence of these one could hardly hesitate to call the thing animal. But internal inspection brought up so many vegetable evidences that Lake was left hopelessly at sea. It had digestion and circulation, and eliminated waste matter through the reddish tubes of the starfish-shaped base. Cursory, one would say that its respiratory apparatus handled oxygen rather than carbon dioxide, and there were odd evidences of air storage chambers and methods of shifting respiration from the external orifice to at least 2 other fully developed breathing systems, gills and pores. Clearly it was amphibian and probably adapted to long, airless hibernation periods as well. Vocal organs seemed present in connection with the main respiratory system, but they presented anomalies beyond immediate solution. Articulate speech, in the sense of syllable utterance, seemed barely conceivable, but musical piping notes covered a wide range of highly probable. The muscular system was almost preternaturally developed. The nervous system was so complex and highly developed as to leave Lake aghast. Although excessively primitive and archaic in some respects, the thing had set of gangliar centers and convective arguing, the very extremes of specialized development. Its 5-lobed brain was surprisingly advanced, and there were signs of a sensory equipment, served in part through the wiry cilia of the head, involving factors alien to any other terrestrial organism. Probably it had more than 5 senses, so that its habits could not be predicted from any existing analogy. If must, Lake thought, must have been a creature of keen sensitiveness and delicacy, differentiated functions in its primal world. Much like ants and bees of today, it reproduced like the vegetable cryptograms, especially the pteridophyetae, having spore cases at the tips of the wings and evidently developing from a thallus or prothallus. But to give it a name at this stage was mere folly. It looked like irradiated, but was clearly something more. It was partly vegetable, but it had 3/4 of the essential animal structure. That it was marine in origin, its symmetrical contours and certain other attributes clearly indicated. Yet one could not be exact at the limits of its later adaptation. The wings, after all, held a persistent suggestion of the aerial. How could it have undergone its tremendous, complex evolution on a newborn Earth in time to leave prints in Archean rock was so far beyond conception as to make Lake whimsically recall the primal myths about the great old ones who filtered down from the stars and concocted Earth life as a joke or a mistake, and the wild tales of cosmic hill things from outside told by a folklorist colleague in Miskatonic's English department. Naturally, he considered the possibility of the Precambrian prints having been made by a less evolved ancestor of the present specimen, but quickly rejected this too facile theory upon considering the advanced structure qualities of the old fossils. If anything, the later contours showed decadency rather than higher evolution. The size of the pseudo-feet had decreased, and the whole morphology seemed coarser and simplified. Moreover, the nerves and organs just examined held singular suggestions of retrogression from forms still more complex. Atrophied and vestigial parts were surprisingly prevalent. Altogether, little could be said to have been solved, and Lake fell back on mythology for a provisional name. Joxerency dubbed his find the Elder Ones. At about 2:30 a.m., having decided to postpone further work and get a little rest, he covered the dissected organism with a tarpaulin, emerged from the laboratory tent, and studied the intact specimen with renewed interest. The ceaseless Antarctic sun had begun to lumber up their tissues a trifle, so that the head points and tubes of 2 or 3 showed signs of unfolding. But Lake did not believe that there was any danger of immediate decomposition in the almost sub-zero air. He did, however, move all the undissected specimens closer together and throw a spare tent over them in order to keep off the direct solar rays, which would help keep their possible scent away from the dog, whose hostile unrest was really becoming a problem, even at their substantial distance and behind the higher and higher snow walls, which an increasing quota of men were hastening to raise around their quarters. He had to weigh down the corners of the tent with heavy blocks of snow to hold it in place amid the rising gale, for the Titan Mountains seemed about to deliver some gravelly, severe blasts. Early apprehensions about sudden Antarctic winds were revived, and under Atwood's supervision, precautions were taken to bank the tests, new dog corral, and crude aeroplane shelters with snow on the mountainward side. These latter shelters began with hard snow blocks during odd moments, were by no means as high as they should have been, and Lake finally decided all hands from other tasks to work on them. It was after 4 when Lake at last prepared to sign off and advise us all to share the rest period his outfit would take when the shelter walls were a little higher. He held some friendly chat with Pabodie over the ether and repeated his praise of the really marvelous drills that had helped him make his discovery. Atwood also sent greetings and praise. I gave Lake a warm word of congratulation, owning up that he was right about the western trip, and we all agreed to get in touch by wireless at 10 in the morning. If the gale was then over, Lake would send a plane for the party at my base. Just before retiring, I dispatched a final message to the Arkham with instructions about toning down the day's news for the outside world, since the full details seemed radical enough to rouse a wave of incredulity until further substantiated. So quoth this raven, "What? You're still here after the whole story? I really appreciate that, darlings. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't. And I always love to hear from you. Have a glorious day, my darlings."